then the system will collapse and the rules cannot be enforced, so they will have no meaning. We do understand the US frustration, but we need to see appointments of the appellate body members start again, because changing a system like that takes time. We have listened to some of the concerns about the way the appellate body functions, and together with other countries, we are working to try to address them. So we want to address the issues while safeguarding the essential principles of the binding nature of the decisions, the independence of the appellate body, and the two-stage structure. This will keep the WTO effective. In parallel to saving this system, we need to update the rulebook. For example, we need to address the challenges posed by China's state-led economy. This leads to massive industrial subsidies and forced technology transfer. There is no point in enforcing rules that are not fit for the purpose. As I said, we wrote the rulebook decades ago, and it was appropriate at that time, but a lot of things have changed. So the new rules need to reflect the economic realities. So that we need to do. We also need to create a new ecosystem, a balance that will allow the whole system to function. For instance, we can let some members move forward on certain topics at different speeds. This will stop narrow interests blocking the whole process of going forward, and it will keep the WTO relevant. Finally, we need to update the systems of the WTO itself. We need to improve transparency. We need to establish processes to resolve trade tensions at an early stage. And we can do this by improving members' notification of trade measures, because today that is not fully functioning. There should be real rewards for following the rules, but there should also be penalties for breaking them. This as well will make the WTO efficient. So things are moving. Many countries are now engaging in the reform process, and this is a positive development. We hope that we will bring this to the G20 in Buenos Aires in a couple of weeks and carry it further. But this is, of course, only the starting point of a very long process. And in this process, the US is a key partner. We are working with the United States and Japan to update the rule book. We are trying to write some of the new rules together around unfair practices by China. And we hope through productive engagement and working together that the US will see the benefits of the system that they built themselves. The European Union are committed open traders. We believe in open, rule-based trade. And without the WTO, there are no rules. Then international trade without WTO would be very anarchic. Countries would be bullied, companies would fall victims of unfair practices, there would be no reliability, no stability. So we need to repair and stand up for the system. And over the past, in Europe, we've been working by building a circle of friends who agree with us, countries who believe that open global trade is a good thing, that trade agreements can be win-win if they are fully anchored in the multilateral system. And these connections we are building with these countries are made through trade deals, but of course they create much deeper links as well. We recently finalized negotiations with Japan. When fully implemented, it will account for 1/4 of the world's GDP. We have a political agreement with Mexico, an agreement with Canada that entered into force a year ago, boosting investment and trade. We have struck agreements with Singapore and Vietnam, hoping they will enter into force early next year. South Korea is in force since a couple of years. We have open negotiations with Australia, New Zealand this summer, and we are negotiating with Chile, Indonesia, Tunisia, and the 4 countries of Mercosur. And these agreements are not only about goods. They are modern agreements fit for the 21st century. Japan opens up its service markets to EU firms. Companies will be able to bid for more public contracts, in particular in railway contracts. Our agreement with Canada allows professional qualifications to be recognized on both sides. And in our agreement with Mexico, we have a specific chapter on anti-corruption, because corruption is not only bad for democracy and the social fabric of the society, it's also very bad for business. So we walk the talk. We have updated old agreements, we are doing new ones, and we want to update WTO as well. There's a lot to be gained from bilateral agreements, but much more to be lost from failure of the multilateral system. So a final few words on our relationship more broadly with the US. As you recall, earlier this summer, President Trump met with the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. They met here in Washington, and they decided that they were both committed to try to find a positive trade negotiating agenda. It was created they created an executive working group to try to find common ground. And we are identifying possible outcomes and making progress, like in light natural gas, regulatory cooperation in some areas. And I'm seeing Ambassador Lighthizer tomorrow to take stock where we are and see how we can go forward. We're also talking there about WTO reforms, like the one we have, the working group we have with Japan, and we hope that we can take this further as well. Because we do live in a turbulent, increasingly multipolar world. Geopolitical shifts, threats, harsh rhetoric. Emerging powers and environmental disasters, unpredictability, instability. And in the coming years, 90% of global growth will not come from the West. So we need to be out there, we need to engage, and in the face of this, partners, friends, old allies, such as Europe and the US, should stand together. Like in the past, we should work together to institutionalize order in the world and update the institutions so that we can secure global trade and, indeed, our own place in the world for the decades to come. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. That was very interesting and comprehensive. In fact, it's a lot. There's a lot to talk about. A lot happening as we speak. In fact, maybe you could pick up with some of your observations, some of the more specifics first, and then dilate out to some of the broader subjects. You talked about some of the WTO reforms. And you highlighted some of the concerns that the U.S. administration has had, frankly, fairly conventional concerns. This administration's predecessors, the Obama administration, the Bush administration, also had concerns about creative WTO appellate body judges, about the imbalance of the WTO system, which, frankly, was negotiated as a system between advanced countries in the 90s, as you highlighted, and so many of the major emerging markets weren't a major and weren't emerging even at that stage, and so didn't take on commitments, and of course China. While there may be a lot of goodwill about doing the negotiations, how do you see overcoming the problem that we had with the Doha negotiations? Ultimately, you have to get consensus of everybody in order to get any of the rules adopted. Any thoughts on that? I mean, will China actually accede to the sorts of obligations that would be implied by the sort of things that this administration would want? Would everybody go along with the constraints on the appellate body judges, so on?
Well, there is no easy answer to that, of course. But the crisis of the WTO is big and it's acute, and it's bigger than just one of these problems, because it is true that the WTO hasn't been able to make decisions for many years. And we are stuck with this old Doha round where we haven't made any progress or very little progress, and the feeling that there is also new things that a global trading organization should look at, and that we can't do that because some countries are blocking progress on that because we haven't made progress on that. So we need to do everything at the same time. We need to deal with the old issues of the Doha round: development, special and differential treatment. We need to also see how we define developing countries. You can't have one size fits all. You can't have the same benefits if you're Laos or if you're China and just calling yourself a developing country. That won't work. We need to make sure that the system delivers for the very poorest countries, but there's also some obligations as you graduate, as Taiwan just did, for instance. So we need to deal with old issues, we need to deal with new issues. We have been working with around 70, 80 countries in Geneva, rich and poor, East and West, who want to deal with e-commerce issues, digital trade. It's just not reasonable that in 2018 we don't have rules on digital trade. And we can do some things there. So there we have started to develop on a plurilateral, meaning that those who are who want to can do that, but it should of course be open and transparent for everybody else. And then we need to change the procedures, how we work, more transparency, better notification. We need to save the appellate body, and we need to update the rule books. All that needs to be done. And the problem is, of course, that it is a consensus-based organization. 164 countries need to agree. But I sense that there is a feeling among almost all countries that the situation right now is untenable. Things have to change, and then everybody needs to make a little effort. And there is indeed a broad engagement among a community of countries, not only the classical ones, who feel that there is a responsibility to try to save the system. So it's slow. It's not going to go easy, but we have started to draft a few proposals, EU and a few others, and we are working with other countries as well, because if we don't do it, it will collapse, and then there will be total chaos, and the poorest country will be the biggest losers.
No, well, you mentioned you need to have full consensus, and indeed the United States is pretty important to that consensus. The in this room a couple of weeks ago, Bob Kagan was presenting his book, The Jungle Grows Back, where he sets out some of the choices that the generation of World War II made in response to the previous war. It is appropriate we're having this conversation just after Armistice Day. And he noted there that one of the things that the creators of this order were trying to prevent was the trading blocs that formed in the 30s, in the 1930s. You may remember the imperial system, preferences for the British, the Germans had their system, the French had their system, the Japanese had their system. And that was one of the things which the institutions were meant to prevent. Of course, we've been very successful for these 70 years with the system growing up until recently. But now we have an administration that has, at best, misgivings about the international order, and not just in the trade context, but most acutely in the trade context. And not just questioning how the WTO system works, but also dusting off some of the enforcement tools that really, frankly, hadn't been used since the 80s, before the WTO system. How do you think it's possible to achieve a negotiation if the current U.S. administration is basically playing with the rule book from the 1980s?
Well, that is indeed a paradox, because we hear the rhetoric and we see some of the actions as the blocking of the appellate body. But I also see that at the meeting between Presidents Trump and Juncker, there was a reference in the joint statement to work together to reform the WTO. And we've actually worked together with Ambassador Lighthizer and the Japanese Minister of Industry and Trade, Minister Seko. We met on 4 occasions, and actually for several hours every time, trying to discuss concretely how to rewrite and update the rule book. So they are also engaging, and I think that the US find this, it's important for them, and we are making some progress there. So this is what we try to do. We try to find ways where we can engage with them together. We also made a proposal to the WTO working groups in Geneva on how to improve transparency and notification. We wrote that, the 3 of us together, and then a couple of other countries have joined as well, as a concrete way to, yes, we hear the concerns, we share some of the criticism, and this is how we try to do it. So we are trying to work together, and we're also engaging with China. We have a working group, EU-China, on try to discuss the WTO. So far it's been mainly around the appellate body, but we're also trying to convince China that if they want to be treated as a market economy, they need to start behaving like one. And if they want to save the multilateral system, which I think they do actually, they need to take greater responsibility. So they need to engage with us to rewrite some of these books and to take bigger responsibility, for instance, on what can be done for the Doha round. China could play a role there. So it's slow. It's not going to happen overnight. It might be a bit idealistic, but it's the only way we know.
And so what's the plan B if China, if
it all collapses? Then that's the road to hell.
Or if it just we have a condition of stasis where nothing's moving quickly. You talked about some of the trade deals that you've been negotiating. Is that the plan B? Is a proliferation of more regional deals, more plurilateral deals as well?
Well, bilateral deals are not an alternative to the multilateral system. But of course, as the WTO is slow and don't have agreements on everything that a modern trade agreement should include, we have not only the European Union, but the whole world is moving on to regional or bilateral deals with each other as well. You see that all across the world. So that is one way, but we make sure that they are fully anchored in the WTO system, that they are transparent and that follow the rules. And at the same time, with these countries, we are trying to work to see what can we do to strengthen the WTO. So it's not a either or, it's both that we try to do. If we fail to reform WTO, well, we're not there yet. I mean, we're going to do this until then of course it would be a disaster for the whole world. And I also note that while the US is criticizing the appellate body, they have taken cases recently to the appellate body, so somehow they must feel that it could be useful at least, and WTO has won most of their cases they brought there, so it's been good for them. There are some criticism indeed, and we can improve the way it's working. We are trying to work with that, to see how can we, make the procedures a bit quicker. How can we make sure that they work according to what was intended and so on. So there are things to be done, but the reason is not the solution is not to bury the system. It's to reform it.
Well, one of the big challenges, of course, is China, which you alluded to. This administration has been very aggressive in advancing its concerns and defending U.S. interests relating to China, both on the trade side with the 301 unilaterally, as well as on the investment side with legislation which, frankly, was not really driven by this administration but by Congress. And there's a broad consensus in Washington, and I think broadly in the American body public, about a need for adjustment in the U.S.-China policy. Now, Europe has a massive trading relationship with China as well. Yeah. And indeed, a lot of the investment flows that would have been going to the US and are not flowing as much now are instead going to Europe because, of course, Europe has a lot of the same technology. Perhaps you could speak about the EU policy vis-a-vis China and on trade and investment, and how you're coordinating with the Trump administration.
Well, obviously, China is in many ways an important partner, but also a difficult one. And we share a lot of the criticism that has been voiced by the Trump administration. We are concerned about the massive subsidies in state-owned companies, for instance. We are concerned about cyber theft, about forced technology transfer. We are concerned about the fact that Europe is very open to investment, but it is not as easy for our companies, neither for Americans, to invest in China. There's discrimination, there is not enough transparency, there are lots of security regulations and so on. That needs to be dealt with. We are trying to deal with that in an investment agreement negotiations that we have with China. It's moving slowly, but at least we are talking about these issues. And it's also a fact that European and American investment to China has gone down because our companies tell us that it's becoming increasingly complicated. So that is bad. So we address these issues in WTO. With China, we are also updating, or actually for the first time on a European level, discussing the issue of investment screening. And here we work with Ambassador Lighthizer as well. The US is updating your CFIUS legislation. I know the Japanese and the Australians and the Canadians. So there's a lot of talk going on this. We are actually trying to see what can be done on a European level. Half of our countries have national legislation, but we are trying to have increased coordination. So there's a lot of both coordination with the US and discussion, and also discussions with the US, with China on this. Of course, it's a difficult partner. Certainly, we are concerned, and also by the increasing problems on surveillance and violation of human rights. But we don't think the solution to this is by massive tariffs. We'd rather see the other way.
Well, it certainly did get the Chinese administration's attention, the tariffs. But
it did.
Well, we've been talking before turning to you for questions. we've been talking here about the diplomacy side of trade, but there's also a domestic side of trade. Trade is one of the parts of international relations that does raise domestic issues very acutely. Danny Roddick, a well-known economist, posited an impossibility theorem that you can have globalization, you can have national systems, nation states, and you can have democracy, two of those, but you can't have all three. And I think he would make the argument that we've been bumping up to that point of where globalization can go before you start to get the pushback in domestic politics. Some would argue that that was what we saw with the President Trump election and the resonance of his campaigning around trade. How do you see, for the Commission, which has some distance from popular European polities, how do you see you can navigate some of those same sorts of domestic political pressures that surface in Europe and that manifested themselves perhaps in some aspects of Brexit, not completely, of course, it's much more than that. How do you see that your role and the role of the Commission in addressing some of those political tensions domestically in Europe?
That's another easy question. Well, certainly we suffered, as you did, but we certainly suffered in Europe 10 years ago, a very, very severe economic crisis. Millions of people unemployed, a lot of social exclusion, young people, and that, of course, led also to lots of people not seeing any future, economic or political future, and that raised to populist parties giving easy solutions to that. They are still there, but also the fact that now that we are regaining growth and the economy is doing much better, that still a lot of people do not feel the benefits of that. And that is, of course, something that fuels frustration and that can be used by a lot of political parties, not only in Europe, but elsewhere. And we certainly have our share of that as well. And so we need, now that the figures are looking much better, to see how can we, because globalization per se is not a bad thing. It's just that we need to make sure that as many people as possible can benefit of the positive things of globalization. So we need to invest massively in training, in education. That we can do a little bit on the European level. But then, of course, member states who we don't have any tax capacity at the European level. They need to also make sure that they organize their social security benefit system, their tax systems, their distribution schemes, what have you, in a way that is much more fair and that reaches out also to those who have been losers of this. Then we can do a few things. We can help when there is an acute crisis. We have something called Globalization Adjustment Fund. We're looking at, can we use that money in a more intelligent way? Can we use it quicker? Can we use our funds in ways to strengthen the areas that has suffered most from this? But it's long-term work, and it also demands a lot of political leadership. So absolutely, we are not immune from that. And it's going to take a lot of time because we also see populists growing in many of the European countries here now.
Well, maybe we can turn it. So first, Sean. We'll start with Sean Donnan, and then we'll work our way across the room.
Hi, it's Sean Donnan from Bloomberg News. Just wanted to ask you, over at the White House right about now, the president is meeting with his trade advisors, and they're discussing how to proceed with auto tariffs. Can you just walk us through what you see as the consequences for transatlantic relations of the U.S. imposing auto tariffs, and what would that mean for the negotiations that you now have or are about to embark on?
Well, I can't possibly comment on that until I've seen them, can I?
Or the fact that the mere fact of having auto tariffs.
The consequences of tariffs, should they come? I think that's...
Well, you read the press statement by President Juncker and President Trump this summer, and it said that while we are exploring this positive agenda in the executive working group, there will be no additional tariffs imposed. So we are under the assumption that that is still valid for the European Union. And I am here to continue and to develop the talks, and later, of course, from both sides, we are reporting to our respective presidents. So we assume that if that were to happen, that would not be for the European Union.
Thanks, Commissioner. Natividad Fernandez, Georgetown University. My question is very, very particular, and it's about the future of WTO or the future of the UK after Brexit. It is supposed that the country will follow the WTO rules with the countries to whom they have no agreement, no bilateral agreement. So my question is your evaluation about that, and also if the UK is sharing the proposals of the of the European Commission concerning the update of the WTO. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Starting with your second question, absolutely. The proposals that we are making to update and modernize the WTO have the full support of member states, and we discuss on a regular basis every step we take this, because we speak on behalf of the member states, but of course we need their backing. So the UK has been very supportive. We just, as recently as last Friday, had a ministerial meeting with all the trade ministers, and I remember clearly the UK explicitly pronouncing their support for these reforms. When the UK leaves, and as you know, these discussions are at maybe a final stage right now, there will very likely be some sort of transition period before they finally leave. And during that period, they will still be a part of the internal market and the international agreements. But once they definitely leave, they will also have to leave the trade agreements that we have on behalf of them. And that is around 40 of them. So during the transition period, they can start, and they've already started to reach out, of course, but then they can start to negotiate trade agreements with the most important partners and try to prepare that for their final. But that they would still stay in the WTO, of course, and I think we will have to solve the different quotas and so on. That is a process, a dialogue that is ongoing. It's not solved yet, but we are talking to our partners on that. So that is very much up to them to define their priorities and their trade agreements. But they will have to leave all the trade agreements that they have with on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you. Will Malden with the Wall Street Journal. I just wanted to ask about the prospect of broader trade negotiations between the U.S. and the EU in terms of a broad negotiating mandate. Given some of the transatlantic political friction, what do you think the prospect is for that kind of mandate, political mandate on either side? You mentioned agreement on LNG, soybeans, and some regulatory issues, but what are the prospects for something broader next year?
Well, the issues you mentioned were by the presidents, and we have been focusing this fall on regulatory cooperation to identify fields where we can facilitate trade in certain areas. We have also said that we would be willing to engage in a smaller agreement focusing on industrial goods, but that would be quite limited. And for that, obviously, Ambassador Lighthizer has asked the Congress just now for a trade promotion authority, so that is in process. I would need a mandate also to negotiate that, but that would be a limited agreement, and that's the prospect we see for the time being, yes.
And a limited agreement would be broad enough to meet the WTO criteria of substantially all trade?
Well, that's the intention, yes. Of course, we tend to follow the WTO, but it will be limited, and member states have been very clear that it would not include agriculture.
And what about others, the auto industry?
Well, we are willing to include autos.
Okay. Please.
Brett Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade. Thanks very much for taking the time to chat with us.
Anybody who's not a journalist here would like to ask a question?
To follow up on Will's question, given the political difficulties that TTIP had, is there an appetite among all the European member states to be able to secure a mandate for any type of trade deal with the U.S. and specifically the Trump administration?
as I said, a limited trade agreement focusing on industrial goods, yes, there is an appetite to do that. And that we can start negotiating as soon as we know exactly what that would cover. When it comes to soybeans, gas, and regulatory, that would be outside a trade agreement. The regulatory component would be based on voluntary cooperation between the regulators. So that is what has been defined by member states, and that is the appetite for the moment and nothing more.
Hi, another journalist, I'm afraid. Doug Palmer with Politico. You said that the member states have been very clear that the negotiations can include agriculture, but the agriculture community here has always been insistent that any trade negotiations do include agriculture because they're concerned that their longstanding concerns will never be addressed. So that kind of presents a political problem for the Trump administration if it wants to go forward with this negotiation. Is there anything that the EU is willing to do on the agricultural front that will help the Trump administration sell this agreement to its farmers? Besides what the soybeans.
That's not really my job, is it? But no, I was in the room when it happened this summer, and President Juncker was crystal clear saying that agriculture would not be in the deal.
Your president, not President Trump.
My president.
Yeah. Okay.
And it was articulated very clearly. And it was also in the joint statement.
So no chlorinated chicken. Sorry? So no chlorinated chicken. Okay. Questions? Right there. The gentleman.
Thank you. Thilo Heinemann with the Rhodium Group, not a journalist. I have a China question. The US administration seems to recently have discovered export controls as an instrument to punish Chinese entities involved in trade secrets theft and other illicit activities. Are there any assessments yet on how that could impact Europe and European companies going forward, given the complicated situation that Europe is having with Iran sanctions?
Not that I have seen. I'm sure there's someone looking at this, but I have to be honest with you, no, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there were two ladies, so we'll do both ladies. Yeah, that's right. You can start, and then.
Thank you. Marie Kasberg with the Atlantic Council. I actually have two questions. One is, are there any takeaways for the European side from the US midterm elections, especially with regards to trade? And the second question is, you talked a little bit about the appetite also on the European side for any trade deals. And I know we've been, from the Atlantic Council, obviously also really closely following the EU Commission's efforts of making the talks more transparent and also going out kind of beyond Brussels to talk to people, to advocacy groups and so forth. I was just wondering what is being done. Maybe also, other public-private partnerships as the European Commission working with others to have some sort of campaign for the public support. I know that was also a big problem during TTIP, and I know that the Commission has been doing a lot on this. Is there something that you think the private sector could do better, or that you could work better together to actually prevent that from happening again when we are ready for a transatlantic deal?
Thank you. Well, on the first issue, I'm not really sure yet, actually, what we can expect from the midterm election on trade. I think it's a little bit too early to say. We're still waiting for the different committees to be consolidated, their members and their ranking members and so on. And of course, it's still the lame duck period, so we haven't been able to reach out to them. So I don't know, maybe you can tell me. We are following this with great interest. But of course, the agenda of trying to deliver on this executive working group still goes on independently. And I think the Congress will be involved in this particular case only when and if there is an agreement to be adopted. But first, of course, the trade promotion, which they have asked for in bloc for UK, Japan, and the US. On your other question, it is true, we had a very complicated debate on TTIP. which I think was a bit unfair, but that related a bit to what you said on the anti-globalization movement as well. It fell into that, because TTIP is still a fantastic idea. To facilitate and to have a trade agreement between the EU and US, of course, it's a very good idea. The conditions are not there now, but of course, one day, maybe they will. But we learned a lot of lessons from that, because it showed that people wanted to be engaged in trade. Up till then, more or less, there had been some events in the WTO and so, but more or less, people didn't really care about trade agreements. It was, nerds like us who did that, and they came up and say, "Here we have a trade agreement." People said, but they wanted to be involved. They wanted to be engaged. They wanted to see what was negotiated. And they wanted it to be not only beneficial to the big companies, but for the wider community. So we did listen a lot to that and change the strategy, making it much more inclusive, engaging with civil society, with companies, with trade unions, with the environmental organizations, consumer organizations. We started to publish all our texts, our proposals, our background documents, the proposals that we sent, and once there is an agreement done, we publish it is entirely online while we do the translation. It's usually between 1,500 and 2,000 pages, but it's online, so you can see it. It's quite technical, but it's still there. And we also made sure that certain basic values are included in the text. So we have trade and sustainable development chapters referring to international conventions on labor, human rights, and environment. And we've also, of course, discussing a lot with the industry, because I think, like trade policy makers, industry, we all became a bit complacent. We thought that trade is good, isn't it? And we kind of forgot to make the case and to explain to people, why is trade important? What is the link between a trade agreement and you as a citizen having more to choose from in the store, cheaper products, that the company in that particular community can employ more people because now they can export, these basic links. And that I think we can do more. We can do more as politicians and policymakers, and we want the business community to be engaged as well, to make the case, to explain what does it really mean if we can have access to that market? What will it mean for this community? Because business and companies, especially small and medium-sized companies, can make that in a much more credible way than politicians. So we need to keep on making that concrete case, to listen to the concerns of people and engaging with them. So in this, yes, we have been asking, and lots of companies have really engaged, and we've been sharing their stories and so on. But I think we can all do much more there.
Sumaya Keynes? No, it was... Okay. All right, first Sumaya, and then after that, the lady after. Fine.
Sorry, jumping the queue. Hi, I'm Sumaya Keynes from The Economist. I have a question about the appellate body and binding dispute settlement. And the question is, supposing it became obvious that actually the US was not interested in being part of binding dispute settlement, then you've got 163 other members of the WTO who presumably don't agree. Is it really that easy to kill binding dispute settlement entirely? Is it possible that the other 163 members would want to retain something like it? Could they go ahead without the US?
Well, we haven't really given up on Plan A yet, to try to see if we can engage by listening to some of the concerns that has been voiced by the US, to try to respond to them, but also try to make broader proposals. We're just in that process now, working with a group of other members to see, can we propose something to bring the US to the negotiating table and see, is this something we can work on? So far we haven't started to plan for an alternative yet, and it also is very time consuming to reach out to the whole membership, because yes, there's 164 countries, but basically there's only 25 who are users of the system. The others, they like it as an idea, but they very rarely, if ever, use it. So you really need to work on that, and that is a process that is ongoing. So we haven't, I can't really answer your question yet, because we haven't really pushed Alternative A at its extreme yet. I'm still hopeful that hopefully we can engage with the US and see if they are willing to save some of the system. Because as I said, it has been good for the US as well, and they are still bringing new cases to the WTO, and for that to work, there is a need for an appellate system.
And is there also in the WTO negotiations or negotiations around the WTO, are there discussions of the dealing of tax frameworks? The U.S., of course, just recently passed tax legislation which has some elements which bear some resemblance to prior tax bills which were found to be WTO inconsistent. The U.S. tends to argue that the distinctions that are made in the WTO system that relate to the tax laws are anachronistic or artificial at best, the indirect versus direct tax. Has that yet been put on the table? And do you, if not, do you think that we're looking towards litigation, EU challenging the US?
We haven't really brought that to. Of course, there's been discussions, and we follow this, but so far it's been more in the margins of the big problems, I would say. So we take one challenge at a time.
Okay. Now it's your turn. I'm sorry. The lady here, just behind Sean. Sean.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Mathilde Hayes from the French Embassy. I have just one question regarding the US demands on including agriculture to the negotiation, and regarding Trump's recent statement on French wine. Do you think there is anything we should expect from the US administration in the negotiations? On agricultural goods, including agriculture and duties on agricultural goods?
Well, actually, we haven't started negotiating yet. We have been talking about regulatory cooperation, but this is something that as I said, is not really a trade negotiation. It is done between the regulators, and we're still about to identify what actually can be done on a short term and medium term for us to start negotiating. There is a process here in the Congress, and the process in the European Union is that the Commission needs to get a mandate. And before we get a mandate, we need to start a scoping exercise, meaning that we need to know what are we supposed to negotiate. And that hasn't started yet. So for the moment, there is no negotiations yet. And as you know very well, especially France, but also some other countries have been extremely clear on the exclusion of agriculture. So the Commission listens very carefully to its member states.
Well, I'm sorry. We must cut it off there. The Commissioner has been very generous with her time this evening, and having just gotten off the plane, and I know you've got a very busy schedule for, you said 26 hours or something like that. So you 24 hours, and so we're chewing into her very precious time. I'm certainly very grateful, and I hope everyone else will join me in giving her applause.
Thank you very much.